Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Cyber Posture Podcast. Joining us is Michael Winkler, a friend of mine. I call him Mike, a seasoned fractional CISO with over a decade of experience helping small and mid-sized business strengthen their cyber defenses. He has an impressive track record of aligning cybersecurity strategies with business goals, achieving milestones like reducing risk exposure by 40% and driving compliances for 15,000 locations. Today, we'll explore his unique approach to cybersecurity and discuss practical strategies for enhancing your security posture. Mike, we're thrilled to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you for the intro. I appreciate it.
And before we get started, Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. The weather here is very cold, but otherwise, not bad.
Okay, great. So before we get started, Mike, the format of our podcast is I'll be asking few of questions to you, which is a question that comes out while we talk to a lot of people in the industry. And the idea is post this particular discussion that we have, our audience should be able to gain some insights and some strategies from you, which you have seen success over the period of years.
Sounds good.
Great. So to get started with, we'll get started with something related to cybersecurity trends. This is a very dynamic field, right? Threats are evolving every day. And as someone who has tackled this over years with extensive experience in cybersecurity and risk management, what do you think are the key trends that is shaping this cybersecurity landscape in the next 3 to 5 years, especially with the wide adoption and rapid adoption of AI, the new generative AI, and the cloud technologies?
So you really did hit on the two key points there. So AI is changing daily, and it is evolving at a rate that I don't think there is any precedent for, right? So even when we had Web 2.0 come about, there really wasn't this rate of change, and the amount of shift we're going to see with AI is going to be very significant. And what does that mean from a cybersecurity perspective? It's going to continue down the same path. So AI as a principle is very data hungry. And in order for you to use it in your business, you have to train it and give it data to ingest and so on. So as that data grows, you start to look at how is that data classified, where is it stored, how is it being exposed to AI publicly or privately, and so on. Those things come to mind immediately, and then you start to pivot to what are we seeing in the attacker space. So what we've seen so far is primarily on the social engineering side of things, where they're leveraging AI to craft more and more unique email messages that incite someone to click on a link. I think AI is also driving a lot of automation out on the web. So when we go to coach a client, we start to look at how they're consuming AI, what sort of API keys are being exposed, what risk does that pose to the client if the key gets exposed. Someone could go out there and spend a lot of their money or however it happens to work, right? And then the second point that you made was around cloud. We continue to see huge, huge consolidations in cloud data centers, leveraging common frameworks. And the cloud providers are somewhat different than, significantly different than most people experience on prem, but the frameworks that they use to enable your environment in the cloud are starting to become the subject of attack in a much more aggressive way. We've seen some data breaches based on failure to follow the frameworks established by the cloud provider for best practices. Also, we're seeing a lot of tools now that help identify where your configurations aren't correct, where your data might be exposed. And this gives visibility into those that are more challenged in the cloud environments. The other things that come to mind are things that are already there. The continued rise in ransomware. Ransomware is a very profitable attack for our adversaries. They all they really need to do is compromise the right individual with the right level of access in an organization, and that account then gets used to encrypt a tremendous amount of data and hold that for ransom. So that I think we'll see. With AI, we're starting to see the beginnings of some compliance frameworks around AI. NIST has come out with one. Google has their own. There's one in Europe. Um, how that compliance is going to be measured and enforced, I think, will be interesting.
So, do you think that is also as a good part as well? Because generative AI is something that can be also used for cyber risk management mechanisms as well.
Yes, actually, I've seen a couple of interesting implementations with Microsoft and E&Y. They're doing quite a bit of work managing a tremendous amount of inbound data that historically was challenged for SIM solutions to do the proper analysis on. SIM solutions are great aggregation points of data, but identification of real events was always very challenging in those tools.
Yeah,
So,
and
I,
also the alert noise.
yes, yes, you spend a lot of resource time following up on things that are of no value.
Okay, so moving on to my next question, as I take the bridge of the risk management perspective that I just mentioned, given the increasing sophistication of the cyber threats, it's very getting sophisticated day by day. What strategies or frameworks do you believe organizations should adapt to effectively manage their cyber risk posture in today's volatile environment?
That's a hard question to answer. I think it's unique to each business and what their goals and objectives are. Key questions we ask are, is this a B2B organization? Do they have a lot of PII? Where is their confidential data stored? How does it move? What do the processes look like, et cetera? But typically, what we like to do is understand what the risk tolerance is for the organization, and the COSO framework is particularly good for that. And then, is ISO 27001 or NIST CSF or the CIS framework a better approach to be evaluating that given organization? And if they handle credit card data, we've got to look at the cardholder data environment as well as PCI to make sure that they're in a good position to become compliant. But all of these frameworks all follow a common thread. And if you read through them, I think you could map between each of them significant commonalities. Some tend to do a bit more at the organizational level, like ISO 27001 is organizational maturity focused. It looks at how effectively you're managing your organization based on ITIL and just common best practices.
Okay, okay. So, Mike, as you know, right, I have a background of being a hacker, right? It has been 12 years I've been into hacking, then translated into cyber security and cyber risk management. But one thing, whenever we talk about frameworks and risk frameworks and all, there's one question that keep on bugging me, and that's like there would be ways through which we would be able to hack systems, right?
Mhm.
So, having said that, you have seen so much in a journey, and right now you're working with multiple organizations. What are what are the most significant advancements in hacking techniques you have observed in recent times? And
Yeah.
what would be your suggestions to the organization in staying ahead of the cyber criminals? Because the threat landscape is evolving massively, right? And there are new hacking techniques that are coming in. So, what would be your view on that?
So techniques from a technology perspective are going to change pretty rapidly based on AI coding tools that are out there and the ability to iterate through those coding tools based on published vulnerabilities, right? So I think that is going to continue to happen. Um, what I also am seeing or have had recent discussions about are very unique scenarios that aren't necessarily technology based. So we saw a fraud incident with a large uh, company that does, it's an online exchange for crypto and other types of instruments. And they had a fraud event where someone had rented out space in an abandoned mall, or not an abandoned, underutilized shopping mall here. And they recruited people and paid them each $100 to test their application. And what they did was these people had to create new accounts in the system using their real identities, their real addresses, and they were given an email address and a bunch of credit card numbers to test that were added to this environment, and they were given a password to use. And then later, people were transferring funds off the credit cards into the crypto environment and moving that on. And the investigation yielded that this is what was happening, right? So all they saw was just an increased number of what they call common point of purchase, where hundreds of credit cards were being used fraudulently with this provider, which their level was very low prior to this event. So that type of creativity, the social engineering side of things, I think is always the one that is going to catch us off guard because it's hard to anticipate.
Yeah.
Technical vulnerabilities are a little bit easier because there's process established for those, right? We get alerts, we know how critical it is, we can prioritize patching, we can, create new uh, signatures for IDS, but the people side, the social engineering is always going to be challenging.
Yeah, one thing that I when I interact with people, I keep asking, because people do ask, hey, is AI going to automate hacking? Is AI going to automate pen testing? Is AI going to take a lot of jobs in cyber? I say, and I always say this: cybersecurity is not a technical space. I take it as a space of art, right? One thing that's something that cannot be taken from human beings is their creativity, and that's what make hacking fun. So I could very well relate to that particular point, Mike, which you made. uh, Having said that, with so much of cyber risk coming in, the threat landscape is evolving at a very massive rate, exponentially. I don't know how to put it, but it's much more than exponentially. With this increasing, what do you think should be an approach for organization to prioritize on those risks, right? How do I understand, go and understand which risk to prioritize and which not to? How do I do that?
So this part of it's a great question because it's a focal point of what I do. And when when I start working with an organization, we begin with an assessment to really understand the technology that they use and what it means to their business. And we ask a lot of critical questions about the value of that given technology. And then we start looking at the dependency chain. For example, we had a manufacturer that would use scan guns in part of their manufacturing process. And that scan gun, if it didn't work, the production line would shut down. The scan gun had a dependency of a server application hosted in another facility. So now I have a
So
server
that's
application.
industrial IoT, right?
Yeah. So let me get to the technical piece, and then I'll bring in the financial, which is really interesting. So I now have a dependency of the internet connection. I also have the dependency of that server, which it turned out to be a Windows 7 machine somewhere. Um, and if that facility is down for 1 hour, $50,000 US cost, right? So that's all of the labor on site. Everybody just stops working. So the
Yeah.
huge impact to the organization. So you have to look at resiliency and failover for everything, right? And looking at how much the business depends on any given piece of technology. And we can take a cursory look, but ideally, if it's a concise organization that does some very distinct things, then your focal points are pretty easy. You look at the ERP system, you look at SaaS vendors and other things that are embedded in the organizational processes and what they mean to the organization. And then you try to quantify if those particular things are down. Could be a workstation, a server, a vendor, a network connection. Um, that quantification was very difficult because it requires discussions with the business, right? As technologists, security folks often want to bake the cake in a vacuum and make something pretty to show, where this is just real arms and legs on the ground, having real conversations with the business about what's important to them and
Yeah.
helping identify where there are points of failure and making pragmatic suggestions on how to go about solving for it. Because there is an infinite number of what I call the next shiny object, and attractive vendors saying we're going to solve all your problems. The reality is there's still a lot of hard work that needs to be done. Technology is one piece of that three-legged stool. It's also people and process. Without the people and process, the technology isn't going to do anything for you.
Right. So just pulling the strings that you just mentioned about cyber risk quantification, right? So with the rise of cyber risk quantification solutions, and when we started, there were very less, but right now there are a couple of other players as well, all trying to solve a very pertinent problem in the industry, which is quantifying the risks so that you can make those prioritized decisions. But how do you think companies can leverage a data driven approach with respect to risk quantification to measure and mitigate the risks more effectively, especially when dealing with evolving threats?
So on the tools side of things, when you are looking at strategy and talking to executive leadership about the investments that you need to make, right? You've got to talk in the language that they understand. The language of business, which is what are my levers when I make a business case? Either I'm going to make money for the business, I'm going to save money for the business, or I'm going to reduce risk in a way that I can quantify it, right? And that's always the challenge, right? So the cyber risk quantification tools can give you a process or a commonality to capture what that means, right? So we were talking about the example of the scan guns, right? Um,
Yeah.
and looking at each point of failure and what the cascading impact of that is. So that one Windows 7 server served like 5 different locations. What is the downtime for each of those, and how do we multiply it? Cyber risk quantification can give you that lens to look at those things and say, well, it would be a very advisable approach to upgrade that server to a cloud environment that I can ensure greater uptime and virtualization in a virtualized environment. It would be a good idea to have resilient internet connections at each one of those sites, or a combination of MPLS and internet. And how you go down that path and look at it, and you compare that risk that you're retiring to the investment that you want to make.
Right. So you just mentioned about the board discussions, right?
Yeah.
So how do you think cyber risk should be presented to the board, right? That's the first question of this particular question that I'm asking, and the second part is, uh, what's the role of the board in decision making for cyber risk management?
It's a good question. So whenever you're speaking at a board level, you want to bring the discussion to their level, and using language that they understand, right? They do, most of them sit on multiple boards, or they have their own organizations of their own, and they've been through this. What you want to avoid is raw data of any kind, right? These are very astute accounting folks, and they're going to take and analyze your data, and that's not something you necessarily want to do. That's not good time spent for them. Um, what you want to be able to do is identify your key risk indicators, right? For me, these are things that you can use your compliance with any of the given standards. But you also want to look very closely at that business to say, here are my key risk indicators. Mean time to recover for our last DR test of our most critical app that the whole business uses. How, where are we at, and what would the impact be if that goes down? Your processes around closing vulnerabilities, for example. It's not how many vulnerabilities or how critical those vulnerabilities are. It's how effective is my process for closing those vulnerabilities. Can I close it in hours, minutes, days? What does that look like? What's appropriate for the business? And then looking at that through the lens of your entire threat surface of the organization. That's your people training, your internet facing applications, your SaaS vendors and other vendors. What does that all look like? And being able to do that can be challenging because you've got to be able to provide something that's meaningful to the audience, right?
Yeah.
What you're also riding a tightrope, right? As a full-time CISO in a given organization, you're often sitting next to your direct supervisor, who's responsible for potentially all of IT. And you want to go into that discussion having prepped with your supervisor, because the worst thing you can do is expose a big risk and not have a challenge, not have a plan for it, right? You never want to go and ask your board for what to do. You want to
Yeah.
tell them the problems you've identified, your plan of action, and potential cost to execute that plan, and get alignment, right? You never want to go with I have a problem and I need your help. That's you're about 3 levels above where you should be if that's where you're approaching your board, right?
Got it. So, one thing that I get to hear as well is when we talk about risk quantification and this particular approach, right? There's often a question that comes, it's super complicated. How do we get started with it? Right. What's your advice to them?
Well, it depends on how big your organization is and how many assets you have and how big that threat surface really is, which is just the nature of the beast and how well you want to be able to do that job. What it's a tough thing in cybersecurity because you have an awful lot of you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And if you put in effective tools that become a part of your ongoing process, they can be a little bit challenging to implement. But as you implement, you also have to put out the processes to make sure that that implementation stays consistent over time. So standard operating procedures, could be at the policy level as well, just to make sure that your tooling is consistent. Without the consistent tooling, you're kind of shooting in the dark, right?
It's like I have a sword, I don't know how to use it.
Yeah, yeah,
So you just mentioned about standard operating procedures, right? And that rings a bell in my mind on many organizations who look at certifications like SOC 2 or ISO just
yeah.
as a certification or a badge, actually not going or keeping a proper process of reviewing those things and all, right? And we often see that a lot of cyber incident happen in them, and they come up and say, hey, we have already these certifications, but why still I'm getting these kind of incidents? So do you think there's a bit of understanding issue with people who come up with these problems?
I'm speculating. When you talk about industry standards and your measurement of compliance with it, it it always comes down to me is how effective are your processes.
Yeah.
If you go into one of these assessments and you look at an organization and say, do you have a mature EDR solution deployed? Yes. Okay. If you end the discussion there, that ticks a box. But what you really want to do is look deeper and say, do you have an effective process to deploy and monitor your EDR solution, ensuring that it's deployed on all devices at all times, is running and kept up to date? That's the question you need to answer, right? And peeling back those layers. If you look at CIS, for example, the first question you're going to see is inventory. Do you have a good inventory of all of your applications and all of your systems? Very challenging for most organizations. If you can get to that level where you've got a good inventory and you know when something is out of the ordinary, you've gone a long way. That's a huge, huge marker. The right tooling can help identify those things, right? You can do network scans, you can do all sorts of things. But as technology evolves and it becomes more and more user friendly, what we see is a bigger increase in rogue technology because people want to bring value to the business. So what we used to see was off-the-shelf applications being deployed in a vacuum on someone's workstation, and then slowly the business becomes dependent on it. Okay. Now we're seeing people going online with AI coding tools and coding applications and showing it to their direct supervisor and saying, okay, this is this great thing I did with AI. And it's the buzzword and people get excited. And how quickly can we implement? You need to engage your security team. That application needs to go through an assessment, your process around building it, where's the code stored, and all of those good things need really, really close eyes. So
Right, right. Uh, Thanks, Mike, for answering all the questions that I had in mind. I have one last question, and I stored it for the last. What's your anticipation, or what's your thought process? What's your predictions that are going to come in Trump second league, right, or second innings with respect to cyber risk management?
yeah, so you're up to speed on world events. So the Trump is not without controversy, right? And people are going to be on either side of that fence. So I think you might see some some backlash at some point. It's hard to speculate, but for Trump himself, just looking at some of the executive orders, we know he's going to want to deregulate things, which will improve the business ability to be nimble, right? Oftentimes, saving money for a given business. How does that translate to cybersecurity? To be determined. If you were to take FedRAMP or one of the other government standards and say you don't have to comply to be a vendor for the government, I think that would be a really bad thing, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that something like that is not gonna come along, because it also is a matter of the stability of the economics of the nation as well, right? Well, thanks, Mike, for that viewpoint. Uh, yeah, were you saying something on the
Yeah.
last?
Yeah.
Okay. So, thanks, Mike, for joining us here today. It was really lovely talking to you, and I look forward to more conversations with you. And till next time, when we meet again on this particular podcast, to help our audience come up with strategies which they can learn from your experience. Till that time, we'll still be connected, and I'll look forward to keep learning from you.
Thanks, Sanket.
Thanks, Mike, and have a great week ahead.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah, bye. So, thank you, audience, for watching us here. I hope you learned a lot from Mike. He has been a very dear friend to me as well. I have learned a lot of things from him, and I look forward to host you all again in our next cyber posture, in our next podcast session, uh, so that you can get to know a lot from the industry leaders. Till that time, stay secure and keep looking towards cyber risk management, and keep stay tuned at Zeron. Thank you.